There was nothing but groggly swirls of illustrationics euphoria. The drugs that had been administered to him were too powerful for anything else. His senses were obstructed. He was alone, with the cackling voices inside his head. They grew louder and louder until he could no longer bear it. He tried desperately to claw at his face, to do anything to hush the dull roar, but in vain. His arms were strapped securely to his chest and the straitjacket that subdued him. He collapsed into the doughy floor beside him. He had been in his miserable cell for God knows how many days now, perhaps even weeks or months, God forbid years. He had long since lost track of time, and yet he did not care. Those damn fools, who in the hell were they think they were, locking him up? Him, a man of science, a bringer of social advances, a hero to mankind. They would regret this, all of them. If they have not have him as their savior, they would have him as their end maker. His brow twitched for a moment as he willed away at the powerful headache that seemed to be following the voices. It was agonizing, yet he was glad for it. The pain seemed to flush in his mind for the heavy psychotropic drugs that the nurses had given him in effort to keep him from harming himself. Ha, funny, because it wasn't for his own safety that they wouldn't need to fear for. As the pain subsided, his vision began to clear. He laid quietly in his cell. It was dark, and only sound of him was that his own shaky breaths. Shaking off the last of his grogginess, he tried to focus. Yes, today would be the day. Now that his mind was free from the iron grip of the drugs, it all came rushing back to him. It had indeed been months since he'd been locked up in this damn place. He had been captured inside the home of one of his patients. He couldn't for the life of him understand why the police had busted down the door and taken him away by force. It had been a way of work for an enemy or a rival practitioner that would benefit him from his absence. That the only logical explanation. In all of his years of service and humanity, he had only ever been striven to help people. He had cared for a great deal for his patients, and they certainly were far better off with them with their lives. So why this? For a moment he thought back to a previous patient, a sweet little girl named Anna. She was no more than 7 years old. He remembered how weak and sickly she was before he began treating her. Her lungs were weak, and she could barely walk on her own. Without treatment, he assumed she probably would have not made it to 8. Tragically, no matter how hard he willed it, he could not picture her face. Those vile bastards would pay for robbing him out of his precious memories. He had been able to finish her treatment. She was now strong and healthy enough to play with other little girls. It was killing him. Just then he heard the rusty creak of the floor holding his cell, as if snapped from daze. His mind began rapidly buzzing over the details he had prepared over the previous months during the short periods of consciousness between medication doses. This would indeed be his last night in his cell, free 99. Consciousness rushing back to him. He drove directly to the wall to his left. He could barely make out the familiar circular shape of one of the buttons attached to the metal material that covered the room. He swiftly leaned forward and gingerly wrapped his teeth around it, pulling as quickly as he could manage without snapping the flexible string attaching it to the plush white fabric. This night had been a long time coming. Over the last month he had slaved in a way his secrecy to bring the fruits of his efforts to harvest. His plan was indigenous, and even if his hands were strapped firmly to his chest, he would have given himself the pat on the back. He froze for a moment. The creaking on the floor handle stopped. He could hear the muffled speech outside of his cell, followed by the footsteps that gradually grew fainter. But lucky break. Another patient had likely began to make a fuss, buying him more time before the night nurse came in to check on him. He resumed gently by pulling on the button until carefully curved a square of the plush fabric popping out. He spat onto the floor and peered over to the near revealed crevice, to reveal what seemed to be the master keys to his escape. Weeks ago, in one of his brief moments of consciousness, he had been struck with the brilliant idea on how he could be finally free from his torturous strongholds. Thus, for his following weeks, he began to prepare. During one of these feeding periods, one of the times he let out was his cell. He had the majority of his restraints removed. He had managed to nab a fork. He would prefer a knife, but these people were not complete idiots. They only allowed blunt and butter knives in the cafeteria, to which honestly less useful than the fork, but Steffley slid down the collar of his shirt while the secretary's staff was preoccupied with another patient who refused to eat and has begun harassing another patient. He made this certain to extra well behaved on his way back to his cell and didn't even fight as they lifted him back to the straitjacket. This worked as well because of his willingness to cooperate. They didn't need to feel. They didn't need to search him thoroughly as usual. Then it patiently sat in the silence as he waited for the lights to go out for the night. Once he was in total darkness, he was free from prying the eye of the security cams. He waited for his eyes to adjust to darkness. Once he could see a foot or two of in front of him, he got straight to work. He knew that the padding was just as about 3 inches thick, and if he were to carefully carve a portion out, it would leave a handy little compartment for storing a strong tool for his escape. He had never been so thankful for his skillful career as a surgeon, more than when he slowly retrieved the fork from his shirt with his teeth. He began the agonizing slow process of carving out the neat and minimally noticeable line in the padding. He worked though for the entire night, and by morning he had only completed the list of 4 sides. He was just able to stash out the fork within the slit of the fabric before the nurse came in to retrieve him for breakfast. He was agonizing tired, but the thought of the imminent escape sustained him. Over the following week, he had complied the carving. The following feeding period, he was able to discard the now horribly mangled fork without being noticed. Tonight would be one of the rest, but soon he would be enacting with the second step of his plan. Every day at precisely 2 p.m. in the afternoon, he would have a checkup with his regular doctor, who would check his vitals and then administer his daily dosage of sedatives. This made his best effort to be pleasant and obedient around his doctor. He had done such a good job of this, eventually the doctor began calling him the star patient and began decreasing his dosages. He became more comfortable enough to leave him alone in the exam room to fetch his things or check on other patients. This was the more irreparable mistake. Over the course of the next following weeks, during the periods of the full congestive function before the doses of drugs, he would have to make careful mental notes to lay out the exam room. One day, to his extreme delight, in the corner of his eye, he saw the contents of the drawer that the doctor was grabbing from a syringe form. From next to the sterile needles were the plethora of sharp, clean scalpels. Now that would do the trick. The next day, as he sat walking and waiting for the doctor to administer his daily dosage of mind-numbing drugs, there was a shriek in the hallway. One of the nurses burst down into the door, covered in blood, and began screaming for the doctor to assist her. Apparently, the patient next door had managed to break free from the restraints and had plunged several sharp surgical instruments into his eyes. This was the perfect opportunity. The doctor turned to him and said, "There's been an emergency. I'll be back in a moment. And I don't think it's necessary for me to tell you this, but you're always such an exemplary patient. But would you please be a good boy and wait here for me?" He plastered the most innocent smile on the face he could muster up, and the sugary sweet voice responded, "Why, of course, doctor." And that was when the doctor closed the door behind him. He promptly got up from the exam table he had been seated on and made his way over to the drawer of scalpels. Thanks to his weeks of excellent behavior, he was now only wearing a part of the handcuffs that followed plenty of enough flexibility for him to quickly slide the drawer open, grab a fresh scalpel. Once again he slid it down his collar and then drifted quietly back to the table. He took a seat as if nothing happened. A few minutes later, the doctor returned, also covered in blood. That crazy bastard must have given him hell, he silently chuckled to himself. Once again he resumed playing on the good boy, and did exactly what he was told. All the way back to his little cell, he then waited for the silence until once again the lights went out. Then he removed the carved portion of the wall with his teeth, and then with some manner, which he removed the fork, he grabbed the scalpel from the insides of his collar. Very good, it had its little cap on. Tucked it away into the cushy little chamber before tucking the carved portion back in its place once more. It would be a matter of days before he made his move. He then jumped at the sound of the holding cell door beginning to creak open. Whatever the fuss the patient next door to him had been making didn't last long. He wasn't ready. Damn, whoever caused the stirring gave him a false sense of security. But he had no choice but to go with the plan. Tonight was the night. It had to happen tonight, or it wouldn't happen at all. The normal night nurse Gertrude was an ox of a woman. Even if he weren't still slightly sedated, or in any restraints at all, he knew better than to try his luck against her. He would have to make it quick work for him, snapping him into him like a twig. However, tonight was different. For the past month, every third Friday, a sweet young woman named Emily would shadow Gertrude, training her to become the fully fledged night nurse herself. Just so it happened to be tonight was her very first night on the job all by herself. She was the only one on patrol on both floors, 3 and 4. That is until you count Ernie, the security guard, if you could call him that. He was a heavy man, to say the least, and had grown a little too accustomed of letting Gertrude take care of all the muscle work. He wouldn't be a challenge in the slightest. How fortunate of him that he was such good behavior, had gotten him moved into his low-risk ward. Poor sweet Emily was a lovely young thing, slender, elegant frame, soft skin that looked as if she could made of porcelain, not to mention her lovely auburn curls. Why the fate had been so cruel. The circumstances had been difficult. He had figured very much he might have fancied her. But fate hadn't been kind. There were these circumstances, and even though they would never be together, she would be his savior, and her delicate frame and lack of experience would have to pave his way to escape. For that he would make sure that she wouldn't suffer. As quick as he could, he dove for the crevice in the wall, clenched into the scalpel with his teeth, and one slid down right in front of his collar. He hurried down and shoved the square of padding back in his place, and with just barely enough time he rolled onto his stomach. He lied still as if the sedatives were still active, and began moaning pathetically. Not for a second later, Emily made her way into the cell. Sympathetically she reached down, and put a comforting hand on his back. "What's the matter, dear?" she said in a sweet voice. He nearly reconsidered the whole plot right then and there, but her innocence would not be enough to save her. My arms! I can't feel them!" he wailed. "Oh dear, what medications are you on? Let me go get my chart." "No!" he gasped. "No, please, I beg of you. Just look at them. They burn like fire, and I cannot move them." She frowned for a moment, but just laid her face down on the floor, howling in agony, and her heart ached for him. And after a moment's hesitation, she began to undo the straps. He lay there whimpering, not moving such a muscle. She knew better than this, but this was a Dr. Harrison's star patient. If she could afford to bend the rules for anyone, it was this man, whom during her entire time was working for the sanatorium, as well as so well behaved. He never gave anyone trouble. So gentle that he wouldn't even dream even to hurt a fly. And who knows, perhaps the treatment was really working, and this man was nearly cured? It wouldn't be humane to stand there and watch him writhe in agony. His breathing slowed and the last of his buckles were undone. He gave a slight shiver as Emily heaved with all of her might to make him sit upright once more, where she begins to examine his arms. As she slowly went up and down, pressing in different points, asking whatever it hurts more or less. He sat there quietly and well behaved until she releases his arms. She scratched her head in confusion as she tried to figure out the cause of this mysterious alignment. Finally she gave a soft sigh and said, "I'm not sure what could be causing this. I'll just have to go get the chart. Perhaps it's a reaction to a new medication?" Just as she turned her head to the door, he slipped his hand down the collar of his straitjacket. His arms were still as pointy as his little sleeves, but he was still able to get a firm grip on the handle. He propped the lid off with his teeth, and then, faster than the poor girl could glance back at him, he had pounced. He held her crushingly tight with his left arm, pulled her close. She struggled with all of her might, but this was his grip that did not break. Her screams echoed in vain, as the closest help was 2 floors away. He tried to hush her, whispered gently in her ear, "Hush now, love. You won't feel a thing." And with one swift motion, he brought the scalpel slightly deeper into one ear to the next, severing her only carotid artery, turning her panic screams into gargling whispers until they faded away completely. He held her limp body in his arms for a moment. What a waste, he thought to himself somberly. He held her until his straitjacket was entirely saturated with her warm, sticky blood, and then he laid her down ever so gently before removing his restraint. After freeing his arms, he gingerly picked up the plucked card key from his pocket and her scrubs. This would be the most useful. He looked down at his own blood-soaked flesh and reflected for a moment. He would need to find some new clothes on his way out. Perhaps he could find some in the storage unit in the basement, where his personal effects would be held. Giving Emily's corpse a final glance, he exited the cell, closing and locking the door, as to not alarm Ernie, should he make it down to this floor. With great haste he sprinted down the hallway, careful not to make too much noise. When he reached the enormous door at the end of the corridor, he pulled out the card key and swiped it through the reader, and he waited for a response. Then there was an audible click. He gently pushed and the door propped freely open. Now he would have to be more on his guard. In his proportion of the hospital, there were far more nurses on duty. He sprinted down the hallway until he saw what he was looking for. An elevator. With his good luck, he pressed a button, excitedly waiting for the elevator to whisk him to his freedom. However, he celebrated too soon. Just then he heard talking, 2 voices right around the corner. He threw himself away in the elevator and wedged himself between a nearby vending machine and the wall. The 2 nurses did not see him, and kept talking as if they came to a stop in front of the elevator. However, they were silent as one of them reached for the button, seeing it was already lit. They glanced up and down the hallway, but just before they could say anything, the elevator let out a ding as it arrived on the floor. They simply shrugged and said, "We've got to get to the maintenance guy to look at this old thing. I'm surprised it's still operating," they boarded. He let out a sigh of relief as the elevator doors came to a close. Now he had to find a different way down. He pried himself out of his hiding place and peered out of the corner. Fortunately, the stairs were straight ahead, and he made a dash for the door before any more nurses had a chance to make their way through the busy hallway. He soon tucked out of sight in a drafty stairway. It was dim and the lights flickered anonymously. He thought for a moment that it was built not quite the frightening atmosphere, but then chuckled. Perhaps he was the monster lurking in his own dark place. His footsteps echoed slightly as he made his way down, 2, 1, and the basement, and then just what they needed. He pulled out his card key once more and swiped it down the entrance of the door. It clacked open a little more stubbornly than the last door. He cautiously pushed through just enough to peek in. There wasn't a soul to be seen, so he merely made his way down the corridor. He glanced at and laminated the map of the floor plane that someone had stamped onto the wall. The storage room was like the personal effects of patients 30 to 300 to 399 were kept up just a little further ahead. With a quickened pace, he soon found the room. Once more he pulled it out with his trusty key card. He swiped it, waited eagerly for the door to pop open. But something was wrong. There was no click, and the door just stood there stubbornly firm as before. He began to panic. He hadn't accounted for this. He would have had to find another key, kill another nurse, or spend more of his precious dwindling time. In a wave of frustration, he violently swiped the key card once more, and to his immense relief, This time he was met with the welcome click of the lock. He quickly pushed the door open and slipped inside. It was a fairly large room, filled with a locker after locker from floor to ceiling. He looked around, trying to find a map of the room so he can pinpoint the location of his locker. Then he noticed a desk on the opposite wall, as it cluttered with some old files that looked like to be a broken computer, but it was also something else, a thick old journal. Despite the fleeing time, he curiously overcame him, and he moved in to pick it up. He fumbled with the middle and found in the notes to be another patient, number 355. He knew that guy. He knew he was there, the first he brought in. Intrigued, he flipped through the pages until he came across patient 399. He leaned a bit closer, in attempt to read the chicken scratch of the offer had left there. Terrible handwriting seemed to be a common trait among all the doctors. He froze upon what he read. It couldn't be true. There was no way. He had tossed the journal to the side and began digging through the old folders until he found his own. As he opened it, photographs came spilling out onto the desk in front of him. His eyes widened at the horrors that lay before them. So many bodies, neatly lined up in gurneys, yet so obviously mutilated, torsos ripped open with rotten entrails leaking out, bloated with sour decay, all missing body parts. Some had clearly had their eyes torn out, with nothing but hollow, decaying sockets in their place. Others were missing important internal organs. It was a baffling sight. All the missing organs had been clearly removed with delicate care, yet the rest of their bodies were violently mutilated, as if fit for immense rage. There was a photo after photo of these horrors. In disgust, he threw himself onto the floor and then snatched up what appeared to be a copy of the old police report. He then began reading it, shaking in his hands. He read as his mind filled with memories. The report read, "On the morning of Saturday the 3rd of February, the suspect, Dr. Evander Locklear, was apprehended from the patient's home. The night before, detectives discovered the horrors that lied in the secret workshop that lied directly towards his clinic. It is believed that he is responsible for the grotesque experiments, mutilations, and murders that estimated 30 to 40 individuals. We believe that the doctor was abducting individuals and was keeping them hostage in his underground chamber, where he later performed some gruesome operations. It appeared that he was holding them into the attempts to harvest their vital organs. Over the course of the next 2 years, he treated approximately 20 patients, in which he transplanted the stolen organs into. One in said case is of a minor, Anna, the last name withheld, whom received a lung transplant. Upon further testing, it was determined that the lungs she received had previously belonged to Paul Kenneth, a recently released sex offender. Kenneth went missing from his home on January 15th, 3 days after he was acquainted of his charges held against him. His body was discovered in an underground chamber Saturday the 3rd. His lungs had been removed from his body. Autopsy results that they had been shown removed while he was still alive." He stopped reading and looked the report down and began to remember. "That's right," he stuttered to himself. "My work, my good work." He had been a savior of good and innocent, those who refused the treatment, and sentenced to death merely because they were too poor to afford proper treatment. Because of him, they could live. The trade-off was minor. In fact, it was good work itself. All those filthy criminals who have done nothing but harm to defile others, those bastards got away scot-free, simply because the hiccup in the court system. Why would they just go to live, while the sweet little Anna Lou should die slowly, drowning to death in her own bodily fluids? It's just wrong. I became a righter of wrongs. I saved countless lives, good people, and I gave those filthy criminals the first opportunity to do something good in their entire lives, perhaps sacrificing their own lives to save the innocents. God will have mercy on their souls. But my work is not done. Oh, far from it. The cities get more and more evil each day, filling with corrupt and wicked people, while the good die young. I'll need to work on this double speed now, and this time I won't be stopped." From there, slowly found his way back through the lockers. He stopped in front of locker 399 and popped it open. From what he found were the clothes that he had been arrested in. Long, dark, burgundy, hooded cloak, and a blood-covered plague doctor's mask. He had quickly slipped in on them on, and much without such a glance, he left the storage room and went throughout the emergency exit. This sent the alarm into wailing, but it was a little more concern of him. He slipped out into the cold, crisp air and vanished into the night. He had so much work to do. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.